He sold their baby's crib to buy a gleaming gold Rolex, gambling. That image mattered more than the life he was about to bring into the world. She was pregnant, terrified, and furious, but he shrugged and said, "Success demanded sacrifice." When he flashed that watch at exclusive parties, no one knew it was purchased at the cost of his unborn child's comfort. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and when his empire crumbled, the same people he'd impressed turned their backs. The pregnant wife stood at his bankruptcy auction, stomach heavy with unborn promise, and returned that very Rolex in an act no one saw coming. James Harrington always wore ambition like a badge of honor. Even before he met Natalie, his soon-to-be wife, he imagined himself among the top echelons of the entrepreneurial world, rubbing elbows with the likes of Mark Cuban, Kevin O'Leary, and other self-made billionaires. He was a man who devoured business books in place of novels, who watched Shark Tank religiously, and who saw every interaction as a potential opportunity. But behind that sparkle of ambition in his green eyes lay the seed of a dangerous flaw: impatience. He craved quick wins and immediate validation. They first met at a charity gala in New York City. Natalie had attended with a friend who volunteered at the event, while James had purchased a premium seat to mingle with investors and philanthropists he admired. She remembered the exact moment she saw him standing near a tall window overlooking the glowing cityscape, fiddling with his cufflinks. His suit was impeccably tailored, and his shoes shone like mirrors. Natalie approached him with a cautious smile and introduced herself. He flashed a disarming grin, and just like that, they became inseparable. Natalie, a nurse practitioner, was everything James wasn't. Where James was driven by external praise, Natalie found motivation in compassion. While James would chase the next big business venture, Natalie took pride in the small victories of her daily life, helping a patient manage their chronic illness, comforting a child during a vaccine, or providing emotional support to a worried new mother. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, they balanced each other. He taught her to dream bigger. She taught him to find meaning outside of money. After 2 years of dating, James proposed in front of a crowd at an upscale restaurant, slipping a modest ring onto her finger that he had saved for by cutting back on personal luxuries for nearly a year. She said yes, through happy tears, and in that moment it seemed life could hold no higher joy. Her parents embraced him as the son they never had, and James's father, a retired firefighter, with stoic pride, gave the couple his blessing. James, always chasing something bigger quickly, grew obsessed with a single objective: becoming a millionaire before he turned 35. He had just celebrated his 32nd birthday when Natalie broke the news she was pregnant. Instead of immediate elation, James's reaction was complicated. He was happy, but somewhere beneath the smiles, a flicker of anxiety shone in his eyes. He knew that children required money, time, and resources, things that might slow his meteoric rise in the entrepreneurial world. By the time she was 6 months pregnant, James had abandoned his safe job at a marketing firm to build his own startup. It was a daring move, but James thrived in risk. He co-founded an app that tracked daily calories, exercise, and mindfulness habits, a product he pitched as the future of holistic health. A well-known angel investor introduced James to Mark Cuban at a tech conference in Austin. Mark didn't invest immediately, but was impressed by James's passion. That brush with celebrity fueled James's pride even more. Natalie hoped the business would stabilize before the baby arrived. She tried to convince James to focus on wise spending, like saving for the nursery. But he insisted on funneling every spare dollar into marketing, coding improvements, and brand expansions. Their sweet brick bungalow, once filled with love and the aroma of homemade meals, now felt like a war room. Whiteboards covered the living room walls, scribbled with growth targets and user acquisition charts. Weeks melted into months. The baby bump grew, and so did the tension. James's quest for prosperity was overshadowing the real blessings in front of him. When he did find success, when a smaller venture capital firm finally poured in a cool $1 million, he wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted the grand triumph, the shimmering lifestyle. And that desire led him down a path that would eventually cost him nearly everything. The baby's crib, handpicked by Natalie, lovingly assembled one sunny afternoon, would soon become a casualty of his ambition. And though she didn't know it yet, that crib was just the beginning of an unraveling that would lead them to a cold, fluorescent-lit auction room where broken dreams and battered pride would collide. James's startup NutriMind finally tasted success on a modest scale. The initial seed round of funding allowed him to hire a lean but talented team of developers, marketers, and sales reps. James believed wholeheartedly in the product. He had drawn up a roadmap that projected NutriMind would be the next big sensation in health tech if he could just pull a few more strings. He spent late nights at the office sipping cold coffee and analyzing the user data, certain that success was just a few marketing campaigns away. It was at a health innovation summit in Boston where fate introduced him to someone he'd idolized from afar, Mark Cuban. Mark was there as a keynote speaker. James, typically brimming with self-assurance, found his heart pounding as he approached Mark after the talk. He gave his best elevator pitch: NutriMind is the future of personal health and mindfulness tracking, everything from nutrition to daily gratitude. We combine wearable data with real-world journaling, bridging the gap between technology and mental well-being. Mark, who'd heard thousands of pitches, seemed intrigued enough to ask a few pointed questions. James answered them with practiced fluency. With a nod, Mark handed James his business card. "Send me more details," he said, and just like that, James felt on top of the world. He pictured enormous checks, national press coverage, maybe even a reality TV feature. His mind spiraled into fantasies of wearing not just any Rolex, but the rare Daytona model that only those with real money flashed at private gatherings. His father's voice nudged at him from the recesses of his mind. "Hard-earned success is sweeter, James. It's not about the watch, but the journey." Yet James had learned that in business, image could be everything. That old firefighter's wisdom didn't resonate with him the same way it once had. He wanted to look the part. He wanted his handshake to sparkle, literally, so potential investors would see a winner, not an upstart hustler begging for validation. He returned home from Boston with fresh determination. Natalie was already in bed, curled up around her growing belly. A pang of guilt struck him for missing the baby's nighttime routine. Natalie always played classical music to her bump, believing it soothed the baby. He wondered if the baby recognized his voice or if he'd been absent too often. The worry slipped away as quickly as it came, replaced by surging excitement about the next stage of NutriMind. He crawled into bed and placed a gentle hand over Natalie's stomach, whispering, "Your dad's going to make it big. Just watch." The next few weeks were a blur of expansions. James leveraged Mark Cuban's tentative interest to court smaller investors and secure a second round of funding. Money began to flow in. So did the demands: more marketing, brand ambassadors, faster development cycles, influencer partnerships. His small team worked round the clock, spurred on by James's relentless drive. But success in the startup world is fickle, and competition was fierce. There were a dozen apps like NutriMind, each vying for that top spot in the health tech market. While the business devoured his attention, Natalie quietly prepared for the baby. She took on extra shifts at the clinic, wanting to save for postpartum expenses. She visited thrift stores picking out baby clothes. She scheduled prenatal classes alone, though she always left a seat open for James, hoping he'd join. Each day, she felt the baby's kicks grow stronger, but her husband's presence seemed to slip further away, lost in a fog of ambition. In fleeting moments of respite, James would glance at the nursery he had yet to help decorate. A wave of shame would pass over him. Then a message from a high-profile venture capitalist or a call from a PR agent would drag him back into the swirl of deals, meetings, and illusions of grandeur. The longing glances at luxury watches became a fixation. He'd even visited a Rolex boutique in Manhattan, letting the weight of a submariner or a yachtmaster glint against his wrist. The sales associate praised how well the watch suited him, and that praise fueled his hunger. As the pregnancy crept closer to term, with baby showers planned and the crib neatly set up in the nursery, James's priorities reached a disquieting pivot. He was on the verge of something big, he told himself, maybe a direct partnership with a massive sports brand or a cameo at a major tech event. If that happened, perception would be everything. And so, in a single, impulsive decision, he sold something precious to fuel his outward persona. Natalie was in her final trimester, exhausted, swollen feet, backaches, but still brimming with anticipation for motherhood. The crib sat ready in the nursery, a white wooden piece with pastel-colored blankets folded neatly over its rails. It was no designer brand, but it was theirs. She and James had spent a Sunday afternoon assembling it while imagining their child's future first steps, first words, first day at preschool. She would smooth her hand over the painted wood, daydreaming of the moment she'd gently lay her newborn down to sleep. James had a different focus. A networking event was coming up, a lavish gala at the plaza where top-tier investors and entrepreneurs would convene. It was his chance to rub shoulders with influential people who could catapult NutriMind to the next level. But in that crowd, appearance spoke louder than any pitch deck. People noticed the suits you wore, the accessories you flashed, and the confidence you exuded. James believed a Rolex on his wrist would be a tangible statement of success, a silent endorsement that he was one of them. He'd eyed a particular model, a pre-owned but immaculate two-tone Rolex, just gold and stainless steel. It gleamed like a trophy. The price tag, however, was far beyond the discretionary funds he had. The startup's money was locked in strategic budgets. Personal savings were meager after months of funneling them into NutriMind. Credit cards were stretched to their limits. But he told himself that every great entrepreneur took a leap of faith. If he showed up with that watch potential, partners would take him more seriously. In a moment of panic and intoxication with status, James looked around the house for something of value. Natalie's heirloom jewelry was off-limits. She treasured those pieces from her grandmother. Electronics. He needed his laptop and phone for work. His gaze landed on the crib in the nursery, still box-fresh, in some parts impeccably maintained. The store where they'd purchased it was known to buy back furniture if it was in near-new condition. He hesitated, swallowing a lump in his throat. But the baby's not even here yet, he rationalized. We can buy another crib later. I just need some quick cash. He convinced himself that once NutriMind hit the jackpot, he'd replace it with an even better crib. Luxury even. The baby wouldn't arrive for another few weeks, so maybe they'd have time. Maybe Natalie wouldn't even notice it was gone until he replaced it. The deception weighed on him, but it didn't stop him. He carried the crib pieces back to the store. He remembered had a buyback program, forcing a tight-lipped grin as he explained they'd had a change of plans. They gave him enough to cover half the watch's cost. The rest he borrowed from a friend, promising quick repayment. A day later, the watch was in his possession, shimmering on his wrist, as if it had always belonged there. James felt a heady rush when he fastened the clasp. He wore it around the house, practicing how he'd adjust his suit sleeve at the gala so others would catch a glimpse. Natalie came home from work one evening and headed straight to the nursery. She froze. The crib was gone. At first, she wondered if James had taken it out to repaint or something. Then she saw the watch on his wrist when he walked in to greet her. Heart pounding, she asked him, voice trembling with disbelief, "Where is the crib?" He hesitated, letting out a shallow sigh. "I sold it," he finally admitted. "It's temporary, Nat. I needed the money for a business move." He gestured at the Rolex as though it was self-explanatory. "This is going to open doors. Trust me." Natalie's face paled. "You sold our baby's crib for a watch." Her voice cracked with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She placed a protective hand on her belly. "James, how could you?" He tried to explain the logic. Image is everything. Investors need to see him as a winner, and winners wear symbols of success. She stared at him in stunned disbelief, tears welling. "You're losing yourself," she whispered. "You're forgetting what really matters." But James refused to see it that way. He clung to the watch as if it were a lifeline. He had convinced himself that in the grand scheme of things it was a small sacrifice for a greater future. Little did he know that watch would become a symbol of everything that would soon unravel. Natalie's anger simmered beneath a veneer of forced calm. She tried to rationalize her husband's decision. Maybe he was under tremendous stress. Maybe once the gala was over, he would return the watch and buy back the crib. But deep down, she knew this was more than a momentary lapse. The man she married, the man who once meticulously assembled furniture for their child, had changed. His eyes glinted with a restless hunger she had never seen before. The tension at home was palpable. She began sleeping in the guest room, both from the discomfort of late pregnancy and the emotional gulf opening between them. At work, her colleagues asked if she was okay, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. Natalie forced smiles, telling them she was just tired from carrying the baby. She didn't dare tell them the real story. The embarrassment of her husband selling the crib to buy a Rolex felt too raw, too personal. James, for his part, was riding a high after the gala. The watch did turn heads. Several attendees asked about Nutrimind, intrigued by the confident man who seemed to be a rising star in the health tech industry. For a fleeting moment, James felt like he belonged in that rarefied world of success. The watch on his wrist felt like a validation of the path he'd chosen. But beneath the surface, pangs of guilt lurked like sharks circling in the deep. He avoided looking at the empty nursery and found excuses to stay at the office longer, burying himself in work so he wouldn't have to face Natalie's tearful eyes. The next blow to their fragile situation came from an unexpected source: the market. A competitor app launched a major update, surpassing Nutrimind in downloads. Investors grew skittish, pressing James for more aggressive strategies. James poured more money into marketing, ignoring cautionary advice from his co-founder, Derek. The burn rate soared. Within months, the finances were precarious. At the same time, Natalie was nearing her due date, and medical expenses loomed on the horizon. Anxiety gnawed at James. He started doubling down on high-risk decisions, chasing quick fixes to keep the company afloat. He borrowed more from personal credit lines. Mark Cuban, after a second meeting, decided not to invest, citing too much competition in the sector. That stung, but James refused to scale back. Ego bristling, he insisted to Derek that Nutrimind needed to go bigger faster. Meanwhile, the watch stayed firmly on his wrist, an anchor he refused to let go of, even as everything else seemed to be slipping through his fingers. When Natalie went into early labor, James was in the middle of a meeting with a prospective partner. Frantic messages from her phone went unanswered. Finally, Derek burst into the conference room, his face ashen. "James, your wife's in the hospital. She's in labor." Panicked, James rushed out, leaving the potential deal hanging. For the first time in months, business was forced to take a back seat. He arrived at the hospital in time to see Natalie in the labor room, face-flushed, tears streaming. She was surrounded by doctors and nurses, the beep of monitors echoing. A wave of relief and shame flooded James. He wanted to hold her hand, but the look she gave him was distant. The labor was complicated. Her blood pressure had spiked, and the baby's heartbeat fluctuated. After hours of painful contractions, their baby boy entered the world with a weak but determined cry. The little one, named Elijah, was tiny, his delicate arms flailing as he wailed his indignation at being jostled into the bright, cold world. Natalie sobbed with relief when she heard him cry, but the look she gave James was a mixture of joy and sorrow. In her arms lay the fragile life they both had created, yet the emotional chasm between them felt almost too wide to bridge. James' tears in his own eyes softly touched Elijah's tuft of dark hair, whispering a promise to be a better father than he'd been a husband. But real life has a way of testing such promises. As the hospital bills arrived and Nutrimind's finances teetered on the edge, James found himself at a crossroads. He could cut back, refocus on what mattered, or he could double down, risking everything for a final shot at glory. In his heart, he knew which path would be kinder to his family, but the taste of near success was too potent a drug to abandon. Elijah's arrival brought a brief period of peace. For a few weeks, James tried to be present. A father who fed his newborn, changed diapers, and learned how to hold the tiny infant without fear. He'd come home from the office earlier, sneaking into the nursery to rock Elijah to sleep. Sometimes, in those hushed moments, he'd stare at the empty space where the crib once stood, guilt flooding him. Natalie had hastily bought a second-hand bassinet to tide them over. She never said a word about the crib anymore, but the silence spoke volumes. Nutrimind's struggles, however, refused to be ignored. The app downloads had plateaued and user engagement was dropping. The marketing budget was nearly depleted. James's desperation grew as the burn rate devoured what little remained of the venture capital. He tried pivoting, adding new features, forging partnerships with fitness influencers, but nothing stabilized the ship. Derek pulled him aside one evening, voice trembling with frustration. "We need to cut our losses or get more funding now." James managed to secure a series of bridge loans with staggeringly high interest rates, hoping that a dramatic user spike would salvage the situation. But each day bled more money. At the same time, personal expenses soared. Doctors' visits, postpartum checkups, diapers formula, the reality of fatherhood slapped him in the face. Natalie took unpaid maternity leave, so her income vanished. James tried everything to juggle the financial chaos, but cracks were turning into canyons. One by one, members of his team left for more stable jobs. Some demanded unpaid salaries. Investors stopped returning his calls. The final blow came when Derek, exhausted by James's unrelenting pursuit of expansion at the cost of sustainability, resigned. He held out a trembling letter, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry, man. I can't do this anymore." It was the ultimate betrayal in James's eyes, but also an inevitable consequence. Unable to pay mounting bills, James slipped into default on both personal and business loans. The watch, once a proud badge of success, remained on his wrist, but it felt heavier now. Each glance at its metallic sheen reminded him of the sacrifices he'd made, the crib, his family's peace, friendships. Natalie watched as the debts piled up, as credit card companies called at odd hours. She tried to help by managing what little budget they had, but it was a losing battle. Eventually, the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on their home. The heartbreak in Natalie's eyes was a knife to James's gut. This was the home they dreamed of raising Elijah in, the place where they'd shared laughter, quiet mornings, and tender nights. To lose it because of his reckless ambition felt like a personal failure beyond measure. Legal notices, demands from creditors, and the threat of lawsuits swirled around James like a vulture circling wounded prey. The final straw came when he realized he could no longer keep up the facade. Even the watch, ironically, wouldn't fetch enough money to pay off everything he owed. He faced the unthinkable bankruptcy. Natalie found him slumped at the kitchen table one night, a stack of overdue bills in front of him, the Rolex, lying on top like an accusing witness. His eyes, bloodshot, pleaded for understanding. She stood there for a long moment, Elijah fussing in her arms. "I'm sorry," James whispered, voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. I wanted to give us everything." Natalie sighed, tears threatening to spill. "You forgot? We already had everything we needed," she said softly, rocking Elijah to quiet him. She looked at the watch on the table, then at James's hollow expression. Money can be earned back. Houses can be replaced. But what about trust? He had no answer. As they entered the labyrinth of bankruptcy proceedings, James realized that the illusions of grandeur he'd chased were just that, illusions. All that remained was to face the consequences, including the dreaded public auction of his belongings to pay off creditors. And among those items, to his everlasting shame, was the watch that had replaced his own child's crib. In the weeks leading up to the bankruptcy auction, James found himself sleepless and on edge. A persistent ache throbbed in his chest each time he thought about standing in front of strangers as they picked through his life's remains, bidding on everything from his office furniture to the fancy coffee machine he'd proudly installed in Nutrimine's break room. But the heaviest blow was knowing the Rolex, his final desperate symbol of success, would be on display for the highest bidder. Natalie did her best to hold the household together for Elijah's sake. They temporarily moved in with her parents, an uneasy arrangement given the tension. Her father was polite but distant, offering James clipped nods and little else. Her mother's disapproval was less veiled, an occasional sigh or a disapproving glance whenever James mentioned job hunting or selling assets. Elijah, mercifully, was too young to understand the turmoil. All he wanted was comfort, warmth, and security. Despite everything, Natalie tried to protect James's dignity. She understood he was a broken man who had allowed ambition to overshadow responsibility. Though her heart still hurt over the crib, she had seen the remorse in James's eyes. She still felt betrayed. Yet a part of her clung to the hope that they could rebuild. "Just be honest," she told him. "Stop chasing illusions and face the reality. We have a son now." James began going to therapy sessions provided by a bankruptcy counselor. He learned about the psychological stress of financial collapse, the guilt that devours individuals who tie their self-worth to their net worth. In one session, tears streamed down his face as he confessed that he still felt the watch was more than just metal. It was his identity, his fleeting taste of belonging in a world that revered wealth. The counselor's gentle but firm voice reminded him that true belonging wasn't found in gold or steel, but in the relationships we nurture. News of the bankruptcy spread quickly among the small business circles and acquaintances. Old friends either offered superficial condolences or vanished to avoid the awkwardness. A few from his NutriMind team reached out expressing gratitude for the opportunities he'd given them, but it did little to ease the crushing shame. Social media, once a stage where James flaunted achievements, now became a silent void. Soon enough, the date of the auction was set. The law firm handling the proceedings sent out public notices listing James's possessions to be sold: electronics office chairs, designer suits, a high-end smartphone, and of course, the Rolex. Approximately 2018 Model 2-tone Rolex. Just read the description, minimum opening bid at $5,000. James felt physically ill reading it. The watch that cost him the baby's crib, and in many ways his marriage, would be showcased like a novelty item. Then, unexpectedly, Natalie made a decision of her own. After seeing James in therapy and witnessing his gradual dismantling of pride, she resolved to take a step toward healing for herself as much as for him. She knew the watch symbolized their downfall, but she also realized how powerful a gesture it would be if she became part of its final sale. Quietly, she made calls to the auction organizers and discovered she could attend, of course, but also potentially place her own bid. She didn't have much in savings. Most of her money went to supporting Elijah, but there was a small inheritance left by her grandmother that she'd carefully tucked away for emergencies. Now, she weighed using it to reclaim a part of their story. She told no one of her plan, not even James. She simply asked him where and when the auction would be. He told her, eyes cast down, uncertain if she wanted to watch him suffer public humiliation or if she was going to show moral support. Little did he know, Natalie had a bigger purpose in mind, one that would bring the story of the crib and the Rolex full circle. The day of the bankruptcy auction dawned gray and cold, matching the mood of everyone involved. The venue was a modest conference room in a downtown office building, harsh fluorescent lights beating down on rows of metal folding chairs. A few serious-faced buyers milled about, flipping through printed catalogs listing James's assets. An auctioneer wearing a tired expression adjusted the microphone on a makeshift podium. James arrived early. He wore a suit that no longer felt like a second skin, but rather a reminder of his battered pride. Natalie came later, holding Elijah in her arms. He wore a tiny winter hat, oblivious to the tension. James's heart twisted when he saw them. He wanted to apologize again, to cradle them both, and promise he would do better, but the moment was overshadowed by the finality of the proceedings. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began speaking in the clipped, staccato patter typical of his trade. One by one, James's life was parceled off. His ergonomic office chair went for $40. His high-end espresso machine fetched $200. Natalie watched as strangers raised bidding paddles without emotion or pity, each seeking a bargain. James's voice remained silent. He had no authority to stop the sales. The court order made it clear all items must go. Finally, after an hour of mundane lots, the auctioneer reached the highlight. Next up lot, number 34, a 2018 two-tone Rolex, date just. Let's start the bidding at $5,000. A hush fell over the room. The watch sat glinting under a small spotlight on the table, representing both allure and tragedy. James felt a lump rise in his throat. Despite everything, his eyes locked onto that watch. Once it had made him feel invincible. Now it was a painful reminder of everything he'd lost. A middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit raised his paddle. 5,000, he said. The auctioneer nodded. I have 5,000. Do I hear 5,100? Another bidder, an older woman in a sharp blazer, lifted her paddle. 51. The increments jumped in slow steps from 51 to 52, from 52 to 53. James forced himself to stare at the floor, each new bid feeling like a punch in the gut. As the price crept to $600, the room went quiet, and the auctioneer began the final countdown. Going once, going twice, a sudden voice piped up from the back, 5,700. Heads turned. Natalie stood there. Elijah held close, her paddle trembling in her hand. The entire room seemed to freeze. James's heart hammered so loudly that he thought everyone could hear it. The man in the pinstripe suit eyed her, then raised his paddle again. 5,800, he counted. Natalie lifted hers again. 5,900. The tension thickened. No one knew her motive, including James. The man grimaced, hesitated, then upped the bid to $6,000. Natalie inhaled sharply. She knew her budget was limited, but she raised again, voice steady. 6,100. A hush settled as the man lowered his paddle, deciding he'd reached his limit. The auctioneer called out, going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the back. For 600, a smattering of polite applause followed, though most remained baffled. James stared at Natalie in disbelief as she calmly walked to the clerk's desk to settle the payment. This was money she could have used for bills for Elijah's needs. Why would she do this? Moments later, the clerk handed her the Rolex in a small velvet pouch. Natalie clutched it, tears brimming. The same watch that had cost them so much was now in her possession. She turned to James and walked over, placing it gently in his hand. "This belongs to our son," she said, voice trembling. "I want him to know the story of how a piece of metal nearly destroyed us, and how we found our way back." James stood there in stunned silence. The watch felt heavier than ever before, a burden he could scarcely bear. Buyers around them continued bidding on other lots, but for a moment, time seemed suspended. Natalie's words echoed in his mind. "This belongs to our son," a reminder of how a piece of metal nearly destroyed us. He wondered if this moment was the turning point he had prayed for. As the auction wrapped up, James helped load a few unsold personal items into a small truck. Natalie waited near the exit, cradling Elijah. Their eyes met, an unspoken exchange passing between them. There was still pain there, deep and unresolved, but also a flicker of understanding. The watch lay tucked in the crook of James's arm, like a sleeping serpent, neither a prize nor a torment, but something else entirely, a symbol of lessons learned. They drove back to her parents' place in near silence, the hum of the engine filling the emptiness. Elijah slept soundly in his car seat, unaware of the day's gravity. Once they arrived, Natalie's parents retreated upstairs, giving them space. Natalie turned to James, her voice quiet. "You know, I still can't believe I spent that money on the watch, but it felt necessary." James nodded, swallowing hard. "I wish I could change everything," he said, tears pooling in his eyes. "The crib, our home, the way I lost myself. I'm so sorry, Nat." A gentle sigh escaped her lips. "We can't change the past, but we can build a different future. If you're serious about therapy, about finding a job, something stable, maybe we can figure this out." She paused, glancing at Elijah, who was stirring. He deserves a chance to see us together, not just physically, but emotionally. James nodded, the enormity of that promise weighing on him. As the days passed, he found temporary work as a freelance consultant in marketing, drafting brand strategies for small companies. The pay was modest, but it was a start. He attended therapy sessions regularly, learning to separate his self-worth from his net worth. The Rolex, ironically, was now locked away in a small safe. James didn't want to wear it, and he couldn't bring himself to sell it again. It was a scar, a keepsake of a painful chapter. Then, one afternoon, Natalie came home from a shopping trip with a large package balanced in the trunk of her car. James helped her bring it in. Inside the cardboard box was a second-hand baby crib, the same model they'd originally chosen, found at a yard sale. Tears stung James's eyes as they unpacked it. He ran his hand along the wooden rails, remembering the first crib he had sold so easily. This time, they assembled it together in her parents' spare room, Elijah babbling on a blanket nearby. After it was set up, Natalie handed James the final piece of the puzzle, a small teddy bear that used to hang on the original crib's rail. She had kept it hidden, a silent reminder of what they'd lost. Carefully, James attached it to the corner, its plush fur brushed against the wood. Elijah's curious eyes tracked the movement. When James picked Elijah up to place him in the crib, the baby cooed, clutching the bear with tiny fingers. Something about that simple scene, Elijah in the crib, the teddy bear dangling, sunlight streaming through the window, filled James with an overwhelming mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that he had a chance to rebuild, sorrow for the pain he'd inflicted to get here. Natalie slipped an arm around his waist. He leaned his head against hers. For a moment, it felt like they were a family again. Not perfect, but healing. The next step, of course, was to find a way forward. James had his new job, but debts still lingered. They needed a stable home, a place where Elijah could grow up without the stigma of living under grandparents' roof indefinitely. And somewhere in the background, the watch locked away remained a question mark. What would they do with it? Would it forever be a memory of shame, or could it be turned into something positive? For now, the important part was that the crib had returned, and with it, a small piece of hope. Months passed like pages fluttering in a breeze, quiet, full of change, and edged with the bittersweet weight of reflection. Life for James and Natalie was no longer chaotic, but it wasn't easy either. Every bill paid, every meal shared, every moment with Elijah felt like a tiny victory. They weren't rich in dollars, but they were rich in effort, and in something that had once nearly been lost: trust. James's freelance consulting gigs were steady now. He had learned to say no to unrealistic clients and yes to projects that aligned with his values. Each pitch was humble, each deadline met with diligence. There were no Rolexes, no pitch decks loaded with dreams of billion-dollar exits, just work, clean, purposeful work. Natalie had resumed part-time shifts at the clinic. She took comfort in the rhythm of patient care, vaccines, wound dressings, checkups, and quiet moments of reassurance to new mothers who reminded her of who she used to be not long ago. She often told James, "This feels like who I'm meant to be," and he would nod, smiling proud of the woman who had never once lost her integrity. Their apartment, while modest, was filled with laughter and Elijah's growing curiosity. He was starting to talk in fragmented sentences, pointing at planes in the sky and calling James Dada, with a squeal that melted even the hardest remnants of guilt inside him. One crisp morning, James sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee and scanning job listings when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar New York area code. He debated answering. Debt collectors occasionally still surfaced like ghosts from their past. Still, he answered. "Hi, is this James Harrington?" A warm female voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "My name is Claire Thompson. I'm a producer for New Horizons, the daytime show on NBC. First, let me assure you, this isn't a scam or solicitation. I'm calling because someone close to you, an old colleague, actually shared a piece of your story, specifically what happened with your startup, the bankruptcy, and the Rolex." James blinked, heart sinking a little. "That's a pretty dramatic footnote in my life," he said cautiously. "Well, we think your journey is more than a footnote," Claire said. "We feature stories of personal redemption and resilience. When we heard about your wife buying back the watch at the auction and how you donated it afterward, we were moved. We'd love to have you and Natalie on the show to tell your story if you're open to it." James went silent. The thought of exposing their worst moments on national TV was terrifying. Yet something inside him stirred a need to not only share their story, but to release the last remnants of shame. He glanced across the room at Natalie, who was spooning oatmeal into Elijah's mouth while singing softly. "Can I talk it over with my wife?" he asked. "Of course. No pressure," Claire said. "We'll send over the details." That night, after putting Elijah to sleep, James explained the offer to Natalie. She listened quietly, arms folded. "You want to go on national television and talk about all of it?" she asked softly. "I didn't say yes. I just thought maybe it's a way to own the story, not hide from it." Natalie sighed. "We've worked so hard to put it behind us. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe someone else needs to hear that you can lose everything and still rebuild." They sat in silence, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room. "If we do this," Natalie finally said, "we tell the truth. All of it. No polishing." James nodded. "All of it." A week later, they boarded a train to Manhattan, Natalie's first time back in the city since she was pregnant. The network had arranged everything: a hotel room, a nanny to care for Elijah during taping, and a warm welcome from the production staff at the studio. Backstage, they sat in the green room holding hands while studio assistants buzzed around with microphones and cue cards. Natalie bounced her knee nervously. James practiced deep breathing. Their story was about to be broadcast to millions. The host introduced them with grace. "Today we have a couple whose story reminds us that second chances are possible even after betrayal, bankruptcy, and heartbreak." Then James and Natalie walked onto the stage to polite applause. Studio lights bathed them in brightness. The interview began. James spoke first, carefully explaining the birth of NutriMind, the allure of success, and the decision that changed everything the Rolex bought with the money from the crib. When Natalie recounted the day she walked into the nursery and found the crib missing, her voice cracked. "I thought he'd just rearranged something, but it was gone. And when I saw the watch on his wrist, it felt like betrayal and abandonment wrapped together." The audience sat riveted. There were no gasps, no judgment, just silence and empathy. James admitted, "I thought I needed to look successful to be successful, but all I did was lose the people who mattered most. That watch didn't make me a winner, it made me blind." Then came the twist. The host leaned forward with a smile. "We heard this story doesn't end there. Natalie, you bought the watch back at James's auction, correct?" Natalie nodded. "Yes. I used inheritance money, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted our son to have the full story. I wanted him to know where we went wrong and how we tried to make it right." The host then surprised them. We reached out to the charity. James donated the Rolex proceeds to Cribs for Change. They told us the money funded not just cribs, but full nursery setups for 23 families in need. The crowd clapped warmly. Then, a dolly rolled out onto the stage, a brand new crib with a plaque engraved in honor of second chances. The Harrington family. Natalie gasped, covering her mouth. James's eyes brimmed with tears. We wanted to recognize your journey, the host added. James turned to Natalie and whispered, I don't deserve you. She squeezed his hand. You're earning us back, one day at a time. The show ended with a standing ovation. Afterward, they were escorted off stage, reuniting with Elijah, who clapped as if he understood what had just unfolded. They laughed for the first time in weeks. On the train ride home, James stared out the window, processing everything. You think people will think we're fools? He asked. No, Natalie replied. I think they'll see people who tried, failed, and still chose love over ego. He exhaled slowly. It's weird. Telling the world about our darkest moments made me feel free. The next few days were a whirlwind of texts, emails, and social media comments. Strangers sent messages thanking them for their vulnerability. Former colleagues reached out to say they admired how openly James had taken responsibility. Weeks later, they received a handwritten letter from a woman in Michigan. Your story gave me the courage to forgive my husband. He made mistakes too, but maybe there's a path forward for us. Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't have to be perfect, just persistent. Natalie placed the letter in a folder labeled Hope. They didn't plan to frame it, but it lived near the crib where Elijah now slept peacefully each night. Life didn't become a fairy tale. James still struggled with confidence. Natalie still had moments of doubt, but they were talking more healing, more choosing each other more. And in doing so, they discovered the twist of fate wasn't just being asked to share their story. It was realizing the story still had chapters to write. Chapters about resilience, humility, and above all, choosing what really matters when the glitter fades. The day after James handed over the Rolex on national television, something shifted within him. It wasn't just relief, it was release. For the first time in years, he no longer felt shackled to the image he'd tried so desperately to project. The watch had symbolized ambition, vanity, and the cost of chasing illusions. Letting it go felt like stepping out from beneath a heavy shadow and seeing the sky again. Back home, life didn't magically become easier. The bills didn't vanish, and their cramped apartment still echoed with the creaks of cheap flooring and paper-thin walls. But what did change was how James approached each day. Instead of scrambling for the next big thing, he started appreciating the small certainties: his morning coffee with Natalie, Elijah's babbled nonsense, the soft weight of his son falling asleep in his arms. James secured a permanent position at a mid-sized marketing agency that specialized in helping local businesses craft their brand identity. The pay was steady, not flashy, but it was honest work, and that he discovered was enough. He even found satisfaction in mentoring younger employees, helping them avoid the mistakes he'd made chasing overnight success. Natalie resumed her part-time shifts at the clinic, balancing patient care with time at home. She was good at her job, caring, attentive, and respected. With James showing consistency, her walls slowly began to lower. She wasn't quick to forget what had happened, but she began to forgive, not for him, but for herself and their son. They moved out of her parents' home after 7 months of rebuilding. Their new place was modest: 2 bedrooms, thin carpet, a tiny kitchen with dated cabinets, but it was theirs. They painted the nursery together, in soft sage green-filled bookshelves with thrifted children's stories and mounted drawings Elijah had begun to scribble in daycare. James hung a whiteboard in the hallway, not for business strategy or growth metrics, but for grocery lists, meal plans, and bedtime routines. At night, after Elijah fell asleep in the crib that had returned to them like a prodigal memory, James and Natalie would sit on the worn love seat and talk, not about failure or the past, but about how to build a healthier, more grounded life. "Do you ever think about starting another business?" Natalie asked one evening, her legs tucked beneath her. James paused before answering. "Sometimes. I have ideas, but if I ever do it again, it's going to be slow, measured, something that lets me be a husband and father first, not a founder chasing an image." She smiled faintly, nodding. "Good, because I don't want to lose you to ambition again." James reached for her hand. "You won't." Their emotional recovery wasn't linear. There were still moments when Natalie would glance at James with uncertainty in her eyes, like when he stayed late at work or got overly excited about a potential opportunity. And James still wrestled with feelings of inadequacy, especially when reminders of his past circulated in business circles. Once, while shopping at a local store, a woman approached and whispered, "You're that guy, the one who sold the crib for a Rolex, right?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just curious. James stiffened, but Natalie stepped in gently, saying, "Yes," and he learned from it. "We both did." Later, James asked, "Does it embarrass you?" Natalie shook her head. "No, because I know the man you are now, not the one you were then." Elijah's second birthday arrived quietly, without balloons or a bounce house, but filled with warmth. They invited close friends and family to a park picnic. Natalie made a strawberry shortcake from scratch. James grilled burgers and hot dogs, careful not to burn them, like he had the year before. Elijah tore through his gifts with sticky fingers and giggles. When James handed him a small wrapped box containing a wooden toy plane, Elijah hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Daddy." That moment meant more than any investor's handshake ever had. At the end of the picnic, James's father pulled him aside. The retired firefighter had always been a man of few words, but this time he put a firm hand on James's shoulder. "You found your way back, son. That takes guts. I'm proud of you." James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Dad." The following week, Natalie donated Elijah's old crib to a local women's shelter. "Someone else deserves to start over too," she said. They included a note inside that read, "This crib once symbolized loss, but it also represents hope. May it cradle a child who brings light into a dark chapter and remind a parent that second chances are real." As they drove home, James glanced at Natalie and felt a quiet awe. She had been his anchor during the storm, his mirror when he didn't like what he saw, and the one person who still believed he could be better. And now they were starting again, not with extravagance or accolades, but with gratitude. One afternoon, James received a message from the producer of the daytime show that had featured their story. The Rolex, auctioned again for charity, had funded an entire year's worth of supplies for a single-parent housing project in Queens. "Your story's still rippling outward," she wrote. James read it aloud to Natalie. She smiled and kissed Elijah's forehead. "That's what real legacy looks like," she said. They didn't own a home yet. The bankruptcy still limited their options, but each month they saved a little more. They attended couples therapy when needed. They cooked dinner together. They laughed. They parented. And when Elijah asked about the watch years later because James planned to sit him down and tell the whole truth, how a moment of blindness cost them dearly, how his mother never stopped believing in what really mattered. and how redemption isn't bought. It's earned slowly, patiently together. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of ambition loss and ultimate redemption. In the end, he sold their baby's crib for a Rolex. The pregnant wife gave it back at his bankruptcy auction. Is more than just a sensational headline. It's a stark reminder that wealth and status can never replace the genuine connections we share with those who love us most. James and Natalie's story shows how quickly priorities can be skewed and how with humility and perseverance, it's never too late to change course. If you found their story inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, share it with anyone who needs a dose of hope, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and heartfelt narratives. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories that spark change and foster a sense of community. Until next time, stay humble and treasure what truly matters.